We appreciate every single one of you. We'd love to know, what part of the world are you watching from right now? Let us know in the comments. Now, let's dive into today's story. The leather of Stephen Ritter's executive chair creaked as he leaned back, studying the family photo on his desk. His wife Melissa's smile beamed back at him, her arm wrapped around his waist at last summer's charity gala. He traced the silver frame's edge, remembering how the photographer had praised them for looking so naturally in love after 20 years of marriage. A knock at his office door interrupted his reverie. Mr. Ritter, Danielle Schwartz, his newest associate, stood in the doorway clutching a stack of briefs. Her dark-rimmed glasses couldn't hide the uncertainty in her eyes. Come in, Danielle. And please, I've told you before. It's Stephen. He gestured to one of the chairs facing his desk. She settled into the chair, smoothing her charcoal pencil skirt. I've finished reviewing the Johnston merger documents. There are a few concerns in section. She paused, glancing at the photo on his desk. A slight frown crossed her face before she quickly masked it. Stephen caught the expression. Is everything all right? Yes, of course. Danielle shuffled the papers in her lap. It's just, I don't mean to overstep, but I saw Mrs. Ritter yesterday at La Maison Rouge. Melissa? She mentioned having a business lunch for her gallery. She was with your brother. Danielle's voice softened. They seemed quite comfortable together. Stephen's fingers tightened imperceptibly on his armrest. Russell's helping her acquire new pieces for the gallery's spring showcase. The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Of course. Danielle nodded quickly. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have. No, thank you for telling me. Stephen straightened in his chair. Now, about those merger documents? As Danielle launched into her analysis, Stephen's mind wandered to the upcoming Christmas dinner. The annual Ritter family gathering was just 3 days away, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt a creeping sense of dread. The Morton and Associates office building emptied slowly that evening, but Stephen remained at his desk long after the cleaning crew had come and gone. He pulled up his phone's photo gallery, scrolling through recent family pictures. There was Melissa at Russell's latest real estate development opening, standing closer to his brother than strictly necessary, Russell's hand resting on the small of her back. Their parents, George and Gloria, beaming proudly, at Russell, always at Russell. His phone buzzed with a text from Melissa, working late at the gallery. Don't wait up. Red heart. Stephen typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on. Okay. Love you. The drive home through Boston's snowy suburbs felt longer than usual. Christmas lights twinkled from every house, but they seemed to mock rather than cheer. He pulled into their circular driveway, noting that Melissa's BMW was indeed missing. Inside their sprawling colonial, Stephen poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and stood at the kitchen window. The perfectly manicured backyard, the imported marble countertops, the life they'd built, it all felt suddenly precarious, like a house of cards waiting for the slightest breeze. His mother's voice echoed in his head from last Sunday's brunch. Russell's new development is revolutionary, absolutely revolutionary. And to think, he's done it all on his own, while you're still just a partner at Morton's. Just a partner. Just the reliable one. Just the older brother who'd never quite measured up to Russell's charm and ambition. The house creaked, empty and accusing. At midnight, headlights swept across the driveway. Stephen watched from the darkened kitchen as Melissa hurried inside, her heels clicking against the marble foyer. She jumped when she found him waiting. Stephen, you startled me. She shrugged off her coat, revealing a dress he'd never seen before. I thought you'd be asleep. Big gallery meeting? Huge potential buyer. She kissed his cheek, leaving behind the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne. I'm exhausted. Coming up? In a bit. Melissa paused on the stairs. Don't work too hard, darling. You know how you get around the holidays. How he got. As if his concerns were always just manifestations of stress or paranoia. As if 20 years of marriage hadn't taught him to read the signs of a lie. 3 days later, the Ritter family gathered for Christmas dinner. Stephen watched from the living room as Russell helped Melissa in the kitchen, their hands brushing as they passed dishes back and forth. His brother's laugh carried across the room, that same charismatic sound that had always drawn people to him like moths to flame. They worked so well together, Gloria Edwards cooed, adjusting her pearl necklace. Russell's always had such a way with people. Remember when you were boys? He could talk his way out of anything. I remember, Mother. Stephen sipped his wine. He talked his way out of quite a lot. George Edwards cleared his throat from his armchair. Now, Stephen, don't start. It's Christmas. Start what, Dad? I'm just agreeing that Russell has always been gifted at persuasion. From the kitchen, Melissa's laughter mingled with Russell's. Stephen caught their reflection in the window. His brother's hand on her waist, her head tilted toward him with an intimacy that made Stephen's stomach turn. Dinner's ready, Melissa called, breaking the tension. They gathered around the dining room table, a feast laid out on the finest china. Russell raised his wine glass. A toast. To family, to success, and to my beautiful sister-in-law, who makes the best Christmas dinner in Boston. Here, here. George and Gloria clinked glasses enthusiastically. Stephen watched as Russell's fingers lingered on Melissa's hand during the toast, how their eyes met with an electricity that seemed to exclude everyone else in the room. 20 years of marriage, and he'd never seen her look at him that way. Stephen? Melissa's voice cut through his thoughts. You've barely touched your food. Just thinking about work, he lied, pushing his turkey around the plate. Big case coming up. Russell leaned forward, all concern and brotherhood. You work too hard, big brother. You should take some time off, travel with Melissa. She was just telling me how much she'd love to see Paris in the spring. Was she? Stephen met his wife's eyes across the table. Funny, she hasn't mentioned Paris to me. A fleeting look of panic crossed Melissa's face before she recovered. Oh, it just came up in conversation the other day. Russell's developing some properties in France and… When exactly did this conversation happen? Stephen, Gloria interrupted, don't interrogate your wife at Christmas dinner. It's unbecoming. The rest of the meal passed in a blur of forced conversation and careful avoidance. Stephen noticed every detail now. How Melissa touched Russell's arm when she laughed, how his brother's eyes followed her every movement, how their parents seemed oblivious, or worse, approving, of the undercurrent charging the air. After dessert, Stephen escaped to his father's study under the pretense of taking a work call. Through the crack in the door, he watched Russell help Melissa clear the table, their movements synchronized like dancers who'd practiced their routine for years. His phone felt heavy in his hand as he pulled up his contact list. Claire McPherson's number stared back at him, his colleague who'd gone through a brutal divorce last year. She'd mentioned a private investigator, someone discreet and thorough. Everything okay in here? Melissa appeared in the doorway, making him jump. Fine. He locked his phone screen. Just work. She studied him for a moment, head tilted. You seem distant lately. Do I? Stephen. She stepped into the study, closing the door behind her. If something's bothering you, we should talk about it. He looked at his wife of 20 years, this woman he thought he knew better than himself. Her perfectly styled hair, her carefully applied makeup, the way she held herself like someone prepared for any challenge. Had she always been this guarded? Or had he just never noticed? Nothing's bothering me, he lied, matching her tone of careful concern. Like you said, I'm just working too hard. Melissa's shoulders relaxed slightly. Well, that's what New Year's resolutions are for, right? Speaking of which, Russell's having a party at his penthouse. We should go. Of course we should. Stephen forced a smile. Wouldn't want to miss another chance to celebrate Russell's success. Later that night, after their parents had left and Russell had hugged them both goodbye, his embrace with Melissa lasting just a beat too long, Stephen sat in his home office. The Christmas tree lights cast shadows through the window as he typed Roderick Simpson, private investigator, into his search bar. His cursor hovered over the phone number. Making this call would change everything. There would be no going back to the comfortable illusion of his perfect life. The memory of Russell's hand on Melissa's waist flashed through his mind. Their shared glances across the dinner table. 20 years of marriage, and how many of those years had been built on lies? Stephen picked up his phone and dialed. You're sure about this? Roderick Simpson's voice crackled through the phone speaker. The private investigator's gravelly tone matched his worn appearance. A man who'd seen too many perfect facades crumble. Stephen paced his office at Morton and Associates, downtown Boston's lights twinkling through the window. Just tell me what you found. The Mason Hotel, every Tuesday afternoon between 2 and 4. Sometimes they switch it up, the Four Seasons, the Liberty. Always high-end places where they blend in with the business crowd. The manila envelope on Stephen's desk seemed to pulse with accusation. He hadn't opened it yet, hadn't looked at the photos he knew were inside. There's more, Roderick continued. The messages on her secured line? They're using an encryption app. Classic move for people who don't want to leave a trail. Stephen sank into his chair. How long? Based on the hotel records I could access? At least 3 years. But these patterns, they're too comfortable, too established. I'd bet it goes back further. The office door opened, and Danielle stepped in with a stack of files. She froze when she saw Stephen's expression. I'll call you back, Stephen told Roderick, ending the call. Yes, Danielle? The Wilson briefs. She set the files down carefully. Are you all right? You look pale. Stephen gestured to the chair across from his desk. Close the door. Danielle sat, smoothing her skirt with nervous hands. Is this about what I saw? Mrs. Ritter and your brother? You were right. The words tasted bitter. They've been. He couldn't finish the sentence. I'm so sorry. Danielle leaned forward. What are you going to do? Roderick, the investigator. He suggests recording devices. Getting concrete evidence before confrontation. Is that legal? In my own home? Yes. Stephen rubbed his temples. God, listen to me. Planning to spy on my wife of 20 years. Danielle's voice was gentle but firm. You're protecting yourself. After what happened with the Hendricks divorce last year. You saw how accusations without evidence played out. The Hendricks case. One of the ugliest divorces Morton and Associates had ever handled. In the end, it came down to hearsay and character witnesses. The wife had lost everything. I can help, Danielle offered. With the recordings, the documentation. You'll need everything organized for when. She trailed off. For when I blow up my entire life? Stephen laughed without humor. Thank you, Danielle. But I need to do this part myself. That evening, Stephen installed the first recording device in their home office, a small, innocuous thing that looked like a USB charger. Melissa always took her work calls there, claiming the acoustics were better. The waiting was the worst part. Every evening, he'd download the day's recordings, listening for proof of what he already knew in his gut. Most were mundane. Melissa discussing gallery business, chatting with friends. Then came a Tuesday afternoon. I miss you already. Melissa's voice, soft and yearning in a way Stephen hadn't heard in years. It's only been 3 hours. Russell's laugh, tinny through the speaker. The hotel's sheets still smell like your perfume. Careful. Stephen's been strange lately. Asking questions. My brother's always been paranoid. Remember when we started this? How worried you were he'd figure it out. 17 years ago. God, sometimes I feel guilty. Don't. We're meant to be together. Stephen's just Stephen, the reliable one, the safe choice. Your parents are ready to support us when it all comes out. They've always loved you more anyway. Stephen slammed his laptop shut while rising in his throat. 17 years. More than 3/4 of their marriage, built on lies. The recordings piled up. Week after week, he accumulated evidence of his wife's infidelity, his brother's betrayal, his parents' complicity. Each file was carefully labeled and backed up, a digital archive of destruction. One evening, Melissa found him in his study, surrounded by work files, his cover for the hours spent documenting their deception. You've been distant, she said, perching on his desk. Talk to me. Stephen looked at his wife, really looked at her. The slight smile that never quite reached her eyes. The wedding ring she twisted unconsciously. How many times had she sat on this desk, lying to his face? Just work, he replied, the familiar life falling easily from his lips. You know how it is. I do. She leaned down to kiss his cheek. Don't stay up too late. And don't forget, our anniversary dinner reservation next week. 20 years? Can you believe it? 20 years. 17 of them a lie. I won't forget, Stephen promised, already knowing he'd cancel the reservation. Their anniversary would be memorable, but not in the way Melissa expected. The 20th anniversary of Stephen and Melissa Ritter's wedding dawned cold and clear. Stephen called the restaurant at noon. I need to cancel tonight's reservation, he told the maitre d'. Table for 2 under Ritter. Of course, sir. Shall we reschedule? No, Stephen replied, staring at the evidence folder open on his desktop. That won't be necessary. He spent the day in his home office, reviewing recordings, organizing documents. At 6, Melissa texted, running late at the gallery. Meet you at the restaurant at 8? Stephen didn't respond. At 7:30, he heard her key in the lock. Her heels clicked across the marble foyer. The sound he'd grown to hate, knowing how often those same heels had carried her to his brother's bed. Stephen? Her voice echoed through the house. Why aren't you dressed? We'll be late for... She stopped in the office doorway. Stephen sat behind his desk, his laptop open to an audio file. I canceled the reservation. What? Why would you? He pressed play. Her own voice filled the room. I miss you already. Russell's response. It's only been 3 hours. The hotel's sheets still smell like your perfume. The color drained from Melissa's face. She gripped the doorframe, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the wood. How long have you known? She whispered. Long enough. Stephen's voice was steady, betraying none of the turmoil beneath. 17 years, Melissa? Half of my life. She straightened, something shifting in her expression. The careful mask of the loving wife cracked, revealing something harder underneath. What do you want me to say? Her laugh was ugly, bitter. That I'm sorry? That it was a mistake? I want the truth. For once. Fine. You want truth? Melissa stalked into the office, her anniversary dress, likely chosen for Russell later, rippling with her movement. The truth is, you were always second best. The reliable Ritter brother. The safe choice. Each word landed like a physical blow, but Stephen forced himself to remain still. And Russell? Russell is everything you're not. Passionate. Ambitious. He didn't settle for being just another corporate lawyer, following the safe path. Her lips curled. He gave me what you couldn't. Excitement, passion, a baby. Stephen's hand clenched on the desk. What? Oh yes, Melissa's voice dripped with malice. Did you really think I couldn't have children? Stephen's world tilted on its axis. The room seemed to spin as memories flashed through his mind. Years of fertility treatments, the disappointment in Melissa's eyes each month, the doctors who'd said she couldn't conceive. When? The word came out as barely more than a whisper. Remember that summer in Cape Cod? While you were busy with the Morgan lawsuit. Melissa's lips curved into a cruel smile. I lost it at 3 months, but it proved what I needed to know. The problem was never me. Stephen gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. All those treatments, the specialists, a waste of your precious money. She waved dismissively. But it kept you distracted, didn't it? So busy trying to fix our little problem that you never noticed what was happening right under your nose. And our parents? Melissa laughed, the sound like breaking glass. Gloria and George? They've known for years. Why do you think they're always praising Russell's every move? They're just waiting for us to make it official. She moved closer to the desk, leaning forward with both palms flat on its surface. Listen, loser. She spat the word. Your brother gave me everything you couldn't. We've had a true love affair for 17 years, and your parents love him more than you. Don't bother calling them to complain. They're already prepared for our marriage after the divorce. Stephen touched a key on his laptop, and a small red light blinked in the corner of the screen. Melissa's eyes caught the movement, and for the first time, uncertainty flickered across her face. You're recording this? Just adding to my collection. He opened his desk drawer and removed a thick file. The Mason Hotel, the Four Seasons. Every Tuesday afternoon, he laid out photos one by one. The encrypted messages, the secret phone, the offshore accounts. Melissa straightened, her confidence visibly shaken. What offshore accounts? You really thought I wouldn't investigate thoroughly? That I'd just accept whatever crumbs of truth you decided to throw me? Stephen's voice remained eerily calm. The art gallery's finances make for interesting reading, Melissa. Very interesting. You had no right. No right? To investigate my wife's affair with my brother? To uncover how they've been using my gallery investment to launder money? He stood slowly. To discover that my entire family has been lying to me for nearly 2 decades? Melissa took a step back, then another. For the first time, real fear showed in her eyes. What are you going to do? Right now? Nothing. Stephen sat back down, his movements deliberate. You're going to go upstairs, pack what you need for tonight, and leave. When you see Russell, tell him to expect a call from my lawyer. You wouldn't dare. Your parents are no longer my concern. He turned back to his laptop, dismissing her. Oh, and Melissa? Happy anniversary. She stood frozen for a moment, her mouth working soundlessly. Then she spun on her heel and stormed out. Minutes later, he heard her heels on the stairs, drawers slamming, closet doors banging. Stephen remained in his office, listening to the sounds of his marriage ending. He opened a new email and began to type. Dear Salvatore Bernard, I find myself in need of your services. Above him, Melissa's footsteps moved from bedroom to bedroom again. Each step marked the death of another lie, another false memory, another moment of their fabricated life together. When the front door finally slammed shut, Stephen walked to the window. He watched Melissa throw her overnight bag into her BMW and speed away, gravel spraying from beneath her tires. In the growing darkness, the house's security lights clicked on, illuminating the perfectly manicured lawn, the carefully tended gardens, the life they'd built on a foundation of deception. He pulled out his phone and deleted Melissa's number. Then he removed Russell's. Finally, he blocked his parents' numbers. In the sudden quiet of the empty house, Stephen Ritter began to plan. The perfect life was dead. Now it was time to build something real from its ashes. The law office of Salvatore Bernard occupied the entire 42nd floor of a downtown Boston high-rise. Stephen sat in a leather chair, watching the renowned divorce attorney review the evidence files spread across his mahogany desk. Weekly meetings at the Mason Hotel, Salvatore murmured, tapping a stack of surveillance photos. Encrypted messages. A recorded confession. He looked up, his dark eyes sharp. And you say there's more? Something about their finances doesn't add up. Stephen leaned forward. My wife's art gallery. I've been reviewing the books. The numbers are too clean. Too clean. Perfect round numbers. Large cash transactions. It's like someone wanted the books to look legitimate without understanding how a real gallery operates. Salvatore steepled his fingers. Money laundering? I need help finding out. Stephen pulled out his phone, scrolling through contacts. I have a friend, Tracy Payne. She's an investigative journalist, specializes in financial fraud. Bringing in the press is risky. Tracy's discreet, and she has resources we don't. The attorney nodded slowly. Set up a meeting. Meanwhile, I'm bringing in Abby Whitehead, best forensic accountant in Massachusetts. Later that day, Stephen sat across from Tracy in a quiet corner of the Boston Public Library. His college friend hadn't changed much. Same intense green eyes, same habit of tapping her pen against her notepad. So your brother's a real estate developer, Tracy mused. Any particular projects stand out? The Riverside Complex, the Harbor Point Towers, all luxury developments. Tracy's pen stopped tapping. Harbor Point? That project displaced dozens of families. There were allegations of fraudulent property assessments, but everything got buried. Buried how? Court records sealed. Complaints withdrawn. Very neat, very quiet. She leaned forward. Your parents, they're well-connected in Boston society? Stephen's jaw tightened. They serve on several charitable boards. Have friends in local government. Perfect position to help smooth over any irregularities. Tracy started writing rapidly. Give me a week. I'll follow the money. The week stretched into 2. Stephen threw himself into the investigation, working late into the night at his Morton and Associates office. Danielle often stayed to help, ordering takeout and organizing files. Look at this, she said one evening, spreading documents across his desk. Russell's company purchased the Harbor Point land for $10 million below market value. The assessor who approved the deal? His daughter suddenly got a full scholarship to an exclusive private school. The same school where your mother sits on the board. Stephen rubbed his temples. Keep digging. Tracy's investigation revealed more. Families pressured to sell their homes at fraction of their worth. Building permits expedited through suspicious channels. Shell companies leading back to offshore accounts. It's brilliant, really, Abby Whitehead explained, pointing to a complex web of transactions on her laptop. The art gallery's the perfect front. High-value items, subjective pricing, wealthy buyers who don't ask questions. Russell funnels money through shell companies. Melissa legitimizes it through art sales. And your parents' connections keep regulators away. How long? Stephen asked. Based on these patterns? Years. The gallery's been handling millions in questionable transactions. But here's the interesting part. It all ramped up after Harbor Point. Something about that project changed the game. Stephen remembered the development's grand opening. Russell's speech about urban renewal. Their parents beaming with pride. Melissa handling the art installation in the lobby. Overpriced pieces that sold suspiciously quickly to shell companies. His phone buzzed. A text from Melissa. We need to talk about the divorce settlement. Not yet, he murmured. Let them make the first move. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning. Stephen read them in his office, noting how Melissa's lawyers demanded half his assets, the house, and a substantial portion of his future earnings. They think you're desperate to settle quietly, Salvatore observed, reviewing the filing. Standard playbook. Threatened scandal. Push for a quick resolution. They don't know what we know. No, they don't. The attorney smiled thinly. Ms. Whitehead's report is ready. So is Ms. Payne's investigation. Shall we arrange a meeting? The conference room at Salvatore's office could have hosted a small wedding. Instead, it held two teams of lawyers facing each other across a polished table. Melissa sat between her attorneys, wearing a cream silk blouse that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Russell sat beside her, his usual charismatic smile firmly in place. Their parents occupied chairs against the wall, Gloria clutching her pearl necklace. Stephen took his seat, Salvatore and Abby flanking him. Tracy sat quietly in the corner, her reporter's notebook open. Before we discuss terms, Melissa's lead attorney began. My client wants to be clear. Any attempt to damage her reputation will be unnecessary, Salvatore interrupted smoothly. We have some documents to review first. Abby opened her laptop, connecting it to the room's projector. Financial records filled the screen, wire transfers, bank statements, property deeds. The Harbor Point development, she began, her voice clinical, purchased significantly below market value through a series of shell companies. Those companies trace back to accounts in the Cayman Islands, which receive regular payments from high-value art sales at the Lynn Gallery. The color drained from Russell's face. Melissa's hand trembled as she reached for her water glass. These art sales, Abby continued, consistently involve pieces purchased for nominal amounts, then sold at astronomical markups to buyers who exist only on paper. The profits flow through a complex network of accounts, eventually funding more real estate acquisitions. This is ridiculous, Russell started to stand. These allegations are supported by extensive documentation, Salvatore cut in, including testimony from families displaced by your developments. Families who were pressured to sell through various means. Some legal, many not. Gloria Edwards surged to her feet. Stephen, stop this at once. You're destroying your family over some petty jealousy. Petty? Stephen's voice was quiet, but carried to every corner. Like using your position on the school board to reward corrupt officials? Like helping cover up fraudulent property deals? George Edwards paled. Son, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Stephen nodded to Tracy, who stood. Tracy Payne, Boston Globe. She smiled as recognition dawned on their faces. I've been investigating the Harbor Point development for months. Fascinating story: fraud, corruption, money laundering. The kind of story that wins awards. Melissa's attorneys huddled together, whispering urgently. Russell's lawyer was already reaching for his phone. Here are our terms, Salvatore announced. sliding folders across the table. Mrs. Ritter will drop all claims to Mr. Ritter's assets. She will sign over her interest in the house. In exchange, we won't immediately turn this evidence over to the FBI. You're bluffing, Russell snarled. Stephen pressed play on his phone. Melissa's voice filled the room. Your brother Russell gave me the baby I always wanted. We've had a true love affair for 17 years. That recording is inadmissible, Melissa's lawyer protested. In divorce court, perhaps, Salvatore agreed. But the financial records? The witness statements? The documentation of bribes and fraud? Those will interest many parties. Gloria tried again. Stephen, please. We're your family. No. Stephen stood. You chose your side 17 years ago. Now you can live with the consequences. The Boston Globe's headline ran on a sunny Thursday morning. Harbor Point Development linked two massive fraud scheme. Tracy's article was meticulous, damning, and impossible to ignore. By noon, Russell's office was swarming with FBI agents. By dinner, the Lynn Gallery had been sealed as a crime scene. Within days, the story exploded across national media. Stephen watched it unfold from his office at Morton & Associates. Danielle brought him updates throughout the day. Russell's investors are pulling out, she reported. His company's stock is in freefall. The Harbor Point residents are filing a class action lawsuit. More headlines followed. Prominent Boston family implicated in real estate fraud. Art gallery revealed as money laundering front. Society couples divorce exposes criminal enterprise. Gloria and George Edwards resigned from their charitable boards. Their phones went straight to voicemail. Their social circle, once so eager to bask in reflected glory, now treated them like plague carriers. Melissa signed the divorce papers without contest. Her lawyers, seeing the writing on the wall, negotiated only for immunity in exchange for cooperation with federal prosecutors. Stephen received the final divorce decree on his desk. Along with it came a letter from the U.S. Attorney's Office, requesting his testimony in the upcoming criminal cases. What happens now? Danielle asked, watching him read the documents. Stephen looked out his window at the Boston skyline. Somewhere out there, federal agents were unraveling 17 years of fraud and corruption. His brother's real estate empire was crumbling. His parents faced social and legal consequences for their complicity. His ex-wife's carefully crafted world of luxury and lies was shattered. Now, he placed the divorce decree in his file cabinet. Now we rebuild. But this time on a foundation of truth. The autumn air carried the scent of change. In the distance, cranes stood idle at Harbor Point, the development's future uncertain. But for the first time in 17 years, Stephen Ritter felt truly free. 6 months after the divorce, Stephen sat in his Morton & Associates office, staring at his resignation letter. The corner office that had once represented success now felt like a gilded cage. Danielle knocked on his door, holding 2 cups of coffee. You're doing it today? 20 years at this firm. He accepted the coffee. Seems strange to walk away. Is it walking away, or moving forward? She sat across from him. The Harbor Point victims need representation. Real representation, not just corporate lawyers billing hours. Stephen thought of the families he'd met during the investigation. Elderly couples forced from homes they'd owned for decades. Single parents who'd lost their life savings to Russell schemes. We could help them, Danielle continued. Start fresh. Build something that matters. I've been drafting business plans. She pulled out a folder. Ritter and Schwartz. Has a nice ring to it, don't you think? The plan was detailed. Office space in a renovated warehouse district, away from the glass towers of downtown. Focus on financial fraud cases, particularly real estate schemes. Pro bono work for victims like those at Harbor Point. It won't be easy, Stephen warned. Taking on cases like these will make enemies. Good. Danielle's eyes sparkled. I'm tired of representing the people who make the messes. Let's help clean them up instead. That evening, Stephen attended his first grief counseling session at the Riverside Community Center. Dr. Laurel Sellers, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, led the group. Loss comes in many forms, she began, looking around the circle. Death, divorce, betrayal. They all leave wounds that need healing. Stephen listened as others shared their stories. A man whose wife died of cancer. A woman whose husband abandoned her and their children. Each story different, yet connected by threads of pain and resilience. Would you like to share? Dr. Sellers asked him. Stephen cleared his throat. My name is Stephen. 6 months ago, I discovered my wife of 20 years had been having an affair with my brother for 17 of those years. My parents knew, supported it even. That's a profound betrayal, Dr. Sellers observed. How are you coping? I work. Started a new law firm, helping people who've been victims of fraud. He paused. But sometimes, late at night, it's okay to be angry, a quiet voice offered. To grieve for what you lost. Stephen turned. A woman with auburn hair and intelligent brown eyes sat 2 chairs away. Her name tag read, Kayla Rich. What helps you? He asked. Teaching. I'm a literature professor. Kayla smiled slightly. Books have always been my refuge. After my ex-husband left me for my best friend, I threw myself into research on betrayal in classical literature. Turned my pain into a published paper. After the session, Stephen found himself lingering in the community center's lobby. Kayla was gathering her things, and something compelled him to wait. That paper you mentioned, he said when she approached. I'd be interested in reading it. Really? She raised an eyebrow. Most people's eyes glaze over when I mention academic publications. I could use a perspective that isn't legal briefs and victim statements. They walked to a nearby coffee shop, talking about everything except their shared wounds. Kayla's passion for literature was infectious, her analysis of betrayal themes in classic works offering a new lens through which to view his own experience. Meanwhile, the new firm took shape. Stephen and Danielle worked long hours, converting the warehouse space into offices. They hired young, hungry attorneys who shared their vision. Tracy Payne connected them with journalists covering other fraud cases, bringing more clients their way. Their first major victory came 3 months later, a settlement for the Harbor Point families that included both compensation and new housing. Stephen watched elderly Mrs. Chen receive her check, tears streaming down her face. You gave us back our dignity, she told him. That night at group, he shared the victory. Kayla's smile across the circle felt like sunshine after rain. You're suggesting we compare my divorce to Medea? Stephen asked, laughing over coffee with Kayla. Their post-group discussions had become a weekly tradition. Well, hopefully without the filicide, she teased. But the themes of betrayal, revenge, justice, they're timeless for a reason. 8 months had passed since their first meeting. Stephen found himself looking forward to these conversations more than any other part of his week. How's the new case going? Kayla asked. Another real estate fraud. Different developer, same playbook? He sighed. Sometimes I wonder if we're making any difference. You are. She touched his hand briefly. Every family you help, every fraud you expose, it matters. The casual touch sent warmth through his chest. Stephen realized he hadn't felt this kind of genuine connection in, maybe ever. Would you? He hesitated. Would you like to have dinner sometime? Not coffee, not after group. A real dinner? Kayla studied him thoughtfully. Are you sure you're ready? I've spent 20 years in a marriage built on lies. Stephen met her eyes. I think I'm ready for something real. Their first date wasn't at one of Boston's elite restaurants where he'd dined with Melissa. Instead, they met at a small bookstore cafe in Cambridge. Kayla wore a simple blue dress and carried a weathered copy of Jane Eyre. For comparison, she explained, setting it on the table. Though I hope your ex-wife isn't hiding any mad women in the attic. They talked for hours. About books, yes, but also about healing, about building new lives from the ashes of betrayal. Kayla understood what it meant to trust again, to risk opening your heart after it had been shattered. My ex and Sarah, my former best friend, they got married last year, Kayla shared. Sent me an invitation, if you can believe it. What did you do? Donated in their name to a domestic violence shelter. Sarah had always hated my volunteer work there. Her smile was both wicked and healing. Weeks turned to months. They took things slowly, both aware of their past wounds. Their dates were simple. Walks along the Charles River, poetry readings at local bookstores, quiet dinners where they talked until the restaurants closed. You're different, Danielle observed one day at the office. Lighter. Is that bad? It's wonderful. She smiled. You deserve this, Stephen. After everything, you deserve to be happy. 5 years after the divorce that had shattered his world, Stephen stood in the garden of the renovated Riverside Community Center. White chairs filled the lawn, while spring flowers bloomed in beds that had once been concrete. Nervous? Danielle asked, adjusting his tie. Strangely, no. And it was true. Standing here, waiting to marry Kayla, felt like the most natural thing in the world. The ceremony was everything his first wedding hadn't been. Small, intimate, filled with people who had supported them through their darkest days. Dr. Sellers officiated, her words about love rising from truth and healing bringing tears to many eyes. Tracy sat with her notebook closed for once, simply witnessing. The Harbor Point families occupied several rows, Mrs. Chen beaming like a proud mother. When Kayla walked down the aisle, her auburn hair crowned with wildflowers, Stephen felt his heart expand. She carried a bouquet of bookstore flowers, pages folded into roses, printed with passages from the books they discussed on their first date. Their vows were honest, acknowledging both past pain and future hope. I choose you, Kayla said, not because I need you to complete me, but because together we make each other better. I promise, Stephen responded, to build our life on truth, to face whatever comes with honesty and trust, and to never take for granted the gift of real love. The reception was held inside the community center, now transformed by the foundation Stephen and Kayla had established. The walls displayed art by local children, while one corner housed a free legal clinic for fraud victims. Remember our first group session? Dr. Sellers asked during the toasts. 2 wounded souls, finding healing through helping others. Now look, not just at your love, but at all the good you've created together. She gestured to the center around them. The foundation, started with Stephen's divorce settlement, had grown beyond their dreams. They'd helped dozens of fraud victims rebuild their lives, established support groups across the city, created spaces for healing and growth. To Stephen and Kayla, Danielle raised her glass, who proved that sometimes the worst betrayals lead us to our best selves. Later, during their first dance, Kayla rested her head on Stephen's shoulder. Happy. More than I knew was possible. He held her close. Though I'm still not convinced about using media in your next lecture on divorce and literature, she laughed, the sound pure and true. What about Jane Eyre? Got any mad women in your attics I should know about? No mad women. He smiled. No lies. No hidden agendas. Just us, building something real. As they danced, Stephen caught sight of the evening's headline on a newspaper someone had left behind. Russell Maxwell sentenced in fraud case. But the name meant nothing now. His past, Melissa, Russell, his parents, felt like a distant story, one that had led him here but no longer held power over his life. Some bridges, he murmured, echoing words he'd said in many interviews, are better left burned. Kayla squeezed his hand. Especially when they lead you to a better destination. Around them, their chosen family celebrated. The community center hummed with life and purpose. Outside, the garden bloomed, new growth covering old wounds, while inside, 2 people who had lost everything danced together, having found something far more precious than what they'd lost. A love built on truth, understanding, and the courage to begin again. Epilogue, 20 years later. Stephen Ritter stood at Kayla's grave, fresh lilies in his hand. A worn copy of Jane Eyre rested against the headstone, its pages marked with her favorite passages. 10 years had passed since cancer took her, but he still brought her flowers every Sunday, still read to her from the books they'd loved. You should have seen Emily's thesis defense yesterday, he told the quiet stone. She channeled your passion for literature. Even quoted your paper on betrayal in classical works. Their adopted daughter, taken in when one of their foundation's clients couldn't care for her, had grown into a brilliant young woman. Now 25, Emily was following in Kayla's footsteps, pursuing her doctorate in comparative literature. She's got your fire, your compassion. Stephen brushed leaves from the headstone. And your stubborn streak. The autumn wind carried the scent of approaching winter. 20 years since the divorce that had shattered his perfect lie of a life. 10 years since losing Kayla to an aggressive cancer that gave them barely 6 months from diagnosis to goodbye. Yet standing here, he felt nothing but gratitude for the 12 years they'd shared. His phone buzzed, Danielle checking in. Their law firm, Ritter and Schwartz, had grown into one of Boston's most respected practices. They'd expanded to 3 offices, all focusing on victims of financial fraud. The Harbor Point case had been just the beginning. Later that afternoon, Stephen sat in his study, reviewing case files. The walls told the story of the past 20 years, photos of his life with Kayla, Emily's graduation, newspaper clippings of their victories. And tucked in one corner, yellowed with age, the article that had started it all, prominent Boston family implicated in real estate fraud. He'd kept track of them all, not out of bitterness, but as reminder of why their work mattered. Melissa had served 8 years for money laundering and financial fraud. After her release, she tried returning to Boston's social scene, but the doors that had once welcomed her remained firmly closed. Last he'd heard, she was living in Arizona, working as a real estate agent under her maiden name, her dreams of luxury and status reduced to selling modest homes in the desert. Russell had faced harsher consequences, 15 years for fraud, embezzlement, and racketeering. The charismatic brother who'd once commanded rooms now shuffled through life as a convicted felon, working minimum wage jobs, his real estate license permanently revoked. His recent attempt to publish a memoir, The Truth About the Ritter Scandal, had been rejected by every publisher. Their parents, George and Gloria Edwards, had avoided prison but not punishment. Their social ostracism was complete. They'd moved to Florida, living off what remained of their savings after legal fees and settlements. Gloria's annual Christmas cards, sent without response, had finally stopped 5 years ago. Tracy Payne had won a Pulitzer for her coverage of financial fraud, inspired by the Harbor Point case. She still collaborated with Ritter and Schwartz, now heading an investigative journalism center funded by their foundation. Dr. Laurel Sellers had retired from counseling but remained on the foundation's board. The grief support program she'd started had expanded to centers across New England. The original Riverside Community Center, where Stephen had first met Kayla, now housed a comprehensive support system for fraud victims, legal aid, counseling, job training. Dad. Emily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She stood in the doorway, so much like Kayla it made his heart ache. The foundation board meeting starts in an hour. Already? He checked his watch. Time gets away from me these days. You were thinking about Mom? Among other things, he gestured to the old newspaper article. Been remembering how it all started. Emily sat on his desk, a habit she'd picked up from Kayla. Mrs. Chen asked about you. She's teaching a financial literacy class at the center now. The elderly woman who'd lost everything to Russell's scheme had become one of their strongest advocates. At 85, she still volunteered, helping other victims navigate their recovery. Did I ever tell you about the day your mother and I got the idea for the foundation? Stephen asked. Only about 100 times. Emily smiled. But I like hearing it. We were walking through Harbor Point, looking at all the families displaced by the fraud. Kayla said something that changed everything. She said, these people don't just need legal help, they need hope. They need to know life can be beautiful again after betrayal. That conversation had led to the Ritter Rich Foundation for Recovery and Justice. What started as a single community center had grown into a national organization, helping fraud victims rebuild their lives through legal aid, counseling, education, and community support. She'd be proud of what it's become, Emily said softly. Of what you've built. What we built, Stephen corrected. You, me, Danielle, everyone who believed in second chances. His phone buzzed again, Danielle reminding him about the board meeting. Some things never changed. 20 years as partners, and she still kept him on schedule. You know, Emily said, picking up the old newspaper, I've been thinking about writing about all this. Not just the scandal, but what came after. The foundation, the healing, the lives changed. Your mother would like that. Stephen stood, straightening his tie. She always said every story of betrayal should end with hope. They walked together through the office, past walls lined with thank you letters from clients, past the conference room where they just celebrated their 1,000th successful case. The foundation's logo, a phoenix rising from ashes, Kayla's design, caught the afternoon light. At the front desk, a new client waited. Another victim of financial fraud, another life needing rebuilding. Steven saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he'd seen in his own 2 decades ago. "Welcome to Ritter and Schwartz," he said warmly. "Let's talk about your future." Later that night, after the board meeting and client consultations, Steven sat in his home office. He opened his journal, a habit Kayla had encouraged, and began to write. 20 years since truth shattered the perfect lie. 10 years since I lost my second chance at love. Looking back, I wouldn't change any of it. The betrayal led me to Kayla. The pain led us to create something meaningful. The lies of my first marriage taught me the value of truth. The years with Kayla, though fewer than we deserved, taught me the power of real love. Today, Emily reminds me so much of her mother. That same fierce intelligence, that determination to find light in darkness. The foundation helps more people than we ever dreamed possible. Danielle still keeps me on track. Tracy still fights for truth. And Dr. Seller's legacy of healing touches lives daily. Melissa, Russell, my parents, they chose their path. Their consequences were of their own making. But their actions, meant to destroy me, instead led me to build something stronger than their lies ever were. Kayla used to say that betrayal was just the first chapter of a larger story. The important part was what you wrote next. She was right, as she so often was. Our story, the one we wrote together, the one Emily and I continue writing, is about more than revenge or justice. It's about healing, hope, and the beauty of second chances. I miss her every day. Miss her laugh, her insights, the way she could find meaning in both classics and chaos. But I'm grateful for every moment we shared, every life we touched together, every bridge we helped others rebuild. Some bridges are better left burned, she'd remind me, especially when they lead you to a better destination. My destination wasn't what I expected. It was better, truer, more meaningful than the perfect lie I once lived. And so we continue, building hope from betrayal, finding light in darkness, helping others write their next chapters. This, I believe, is the truest revenge, not destroying those who hurt us, but building something beautiful from the ashes they left behind. In the end, that's what Kayla taught me. Every betrayal has 2 possible endings. You can let it destroy you, or you can use it to build something stronger. We chose to build, and that has made all the difference. Steven closed the journal and looked at Kayla's picture on his desk. Her smile, caught mid-laugh during their wedding at the community center, still warmed his heart. Beside it sat a more recent photo. Emily at her graduation, Danielle and Tracy beside her, all of them beaming. Tomorrow would bring new clients, new challenges, new chances to help others rebuild. The perfect lie of his past had given way to something far more valuable, a life of purpose, built on truth, strengthened by love, dedicated to helping others find their way through darkness to light. And somewhere, he liked to think, Kayla was smiling. This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your time. If you enjoy this story, please subscribe to this channel. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.